The Mystery of BELICENA VILLCA. Second Book. The Letter of BELICENA VILLCA. Sixth Day. The mountain range Katacha has always been rich in gold and silver. While my people were strong in the Iberian Peninsula, that riches permitted to the lords of Tharsis to live with great splendor. The strategic mode of life had been forgotten thousands of years ago before to acquire the rights of such scenery, and the land was not occupied anymore to practice the magic cultivation. In that period, was believed in the property of the land and the power of gold. All the kingdoms were infested of merchants who offered, for gold, the most beautiful things: spices, woven dresses, utensils, jewels, and even weapons. Yes, weapons that before were manufactured by each combatant population, being the most perfect the ones accumulated by the populations of the Pact of Blood, then could be purchased to the dealers by a handful of gold. And the lords of Tharsis, with their gold and silver, which were bought to the peasants the half of their harvest. The other half, less than the necessary to subsist, corresponded as is logic to the lords of Tharsis, for being the owners of the land. And the excess of those aliments, with the gold and silver which abounded, would pass to the ports of VILLCA, which then was named Onaba, to becoming goods of the most varied species. The Phoenicians, descendants of the red race of the Atlantis, were counted amongst the populations which had associated since the beginning to the cultural pact. In the past they had been sworn foes of the Iberians. Only 100 years before my family arrived to the seigneury of Tharsis, the Phoenicians had occupied the citadel of Tarshish, which was enclaved near to the confluence of the rivers Tinta and Odiel. Finally, after a brief but fierce war, my people recovered the territory, although conditioned by a peace agreement which allowed the free market of the red race. From Tarshish to Onaba, in little fluvial transports or in caravans, and from Onaba to Middle East in foreign ships, the Phoenicians monopolized the trading of goods due to the presence of merchants from other populaces was incomparably minor. Without judging here the cultural impact that such commercial trade caused in the customs of my people, the truth is that the lords of Tharsis governed a calm population, which was becoming famous for its richness and prosperity. But that illusory peace soon came to be perturbed, and not precisely, as could be concluded in a superficial observation, because the gold of Tharsis would awake the greed of the foreign populaces and conquerors. Such greed existed, and invaders and conquerors were many. However, the main reason of all problems, and finally the ruin of the house of Tharsis, was the advent of the Gelams. Since the 8th century before Christ, approximately, when Sargon, king of Assyria, destroyed the kingdom of Israel, the Gelams started to appear in the Iberian Peninsula. First they came accompanying the Phoenicians' merchants, and landed in all the ports of the Mediterranean Sea, but then was proved that they also advanced by land, behind a Scythian population, that they dominated Asia Minor. This population, which was of our same race, crossed Europe from east to west and arrived to Spain 2 centuries later, when the destructive work of the damned Gelams was advanced enough. The Gelams, for their part, clearly evidenced that they belonged to another race, and they affirmed it with pride. They were members, they conceited, of the chosen people, by the Creator God to reign over the earth. Their masters were the Egyptians' priests, and they came, thereby, in representation of the swarthy Atlantans. All the native populations of the peninsula, which also arrived with the Gelams, not remembered the strategic way of life, and they were in power of priests of different cults. The mission of the Gelams consisted in to demonstrate their priestly authority and unify the cults. For it they disposed of diabolic powers that evoked undoubtedly to the swarthy Atlantans, and a cruelty with no limits. Then the Creator God and the potencies of the matter sent them to reaffirm the cultural pact. Times were ready for men to receive a new revelation, a knowledge that would bring more peace, progress and civilization than the reached thence by the populations of the cultural pact, an idea that one day would make those goods permanent and would end forever with the evil and wars. That revelation, that knowledge, that idea, was synthesized in the next concept: the singularity of God, behind the plurality of the cults. The Gellams, indeed, had come to illuminate the populations, and the priest of all cults, relating to the multiplicity of God and the necessary union that this one maintains on his own sphere. This would be the formula. Above all things are the gods, and above all the gods is the one. For this reason, they not pretended to replace the gods, or change their names, neither to alter the form of the cults. It is natural, they said, that God has many names, because he exhibits many faces. It is comprehensible, also, the existence of many cults to worship the different faces of God. Nothing of this offends God, nothing of this questions his unity. But when the one will show inflexible with men, where he won't accept apologies, where he will put his thousand justness eyes, will be in the sacrifice of the cult. Because, whatever could be the form of the cult, the sacrifice is one, that's to say, the sacrifice participates from the one. According to this newfangled revelation, the unity of the Creator God was proved in the ritual sacrifice, and the worship to the Creator God, for every cult, was demonstrated by the ritual sacrifice. Oh, Doctor, even if today those cults seem to be distant practices of ancient times, I can't think without shudder, with horror in the thousands of human victims produced by the discovery of the Gellams. I will refer now to a tough aspect of the behavior of the Gellams. Perhaps, the key is in the fact that they considered the Creator God, in his absolute unity, as masculine. The one, in fact, was a male god, and nothing was above or below him to equilibrate or neutralize that polarity. They admitted a relative cosmic androgyny until a specific level, dwelt by gods and goddesses properly mated. But in the summit, as creator and lord of the other gods, was the one, who was not androgyny, neither neuter but masculine. The one not admitted goddesses beside him because he by himself was enough to exist. Was a lonely male god. With such aberrant conception must not surprise that the Gellams were also lonely men. However, even if the key of their behavior is here, it must not be so easy to derive from this the principle that took them to practice between them the onanism, and the ritual sodomy. Because they usually dwelled in forests, away from the population, and their depraved practices, many believed that the Gellams came from Phrygia, where existed an ancient cult of the male Bebuute, which was also related to the sodomite priests. There the priests castrated themselves voluntarily, and the temple was guarded by a court of eunuchs. Others supposed that they came from India, where was known since ancient times a cult of phallus worshippers. But the Gellams didn't come from Phrygia, neither from India, but from Canaan, and they not practiced the castration, neither the worship of the phallus, but simply the sodomy. They had exiled the woman in the same way that their god had dethroned all the goddesses. They had a solitary life and usually exempt from pleasures, except the ritual sodomy, which represented the self-sufficiency of him. Logically, even if the Gellams were extremely tolerant to the form of the cults, and the only in what they didn't transgress was in what concerned to the unity of God in the sacrifice, is understood that they manifested predilection for the populations which their cults personified male gods, and some contempt to the worshippers of goddesses. Very soon this attitude of indifference or contempt, when not just of rejection, that the Gellams dispensed to the goddess, would enter in collision with such particular form that the Iberian people had adopted in the cult of BELICENA. But they counted, certainly, with the support of the potencies of the matter. In other form, their success could not be explained. Due to in relatively short time, they achieved to dominate the populaces of Hispania, and, inclusive, Hibernia, Britain, Armoriaca and Gaul. Even by the increasing power of the Gellem, their sinister doctrine would have not produced any harm to the lords of Tharsis, always disposed to accept all that contributed to improve the practice of the cult. Were not the sacrifices of the one what determined the luck of my family, but other activity that the Gellams realized with great energy. They attempted by every means to fulfill the second part of the cultural pact. It means that, even though it was not necessary to make the war with the populations of the Pact of Blood anymore, because they were already culturally defeated, still remained intact many megalithic works of the White Atlantans, and that constituted a sin that cried to heaven. the populations of the cultural pact missed their compromises with the gods, and that guilty would be severely punished. Nevertheless, and by luck for them, existed a solution: to practice the sacrifice with the major rigor, and help the Gelms in the fulfillment of the mission. In other words, the native populations had now to be consecrated to the sacrifice themselves and as a reward, the Gelms would release them from the divine punishment, executing the destruction of the megalithic works or their neutralization. This would be all, if it was not because the gods had made a warning, and who disobeyed it would risk to be destroyed without mercy in an exemplary punishment of me. What would be not forgotten in no way thence, due to the patience of the gods was exhausted, was the remembrance of the pact of blood and the quest for the wisdom. That was the forbidden, the abominable for the eyes of the gods. But the most forbidden and most abominable, and irredeemable sin, was without doubts the desire to conserve the stone of Venus, would suffer the sentence of the extermination, that is to say, he would pay with the destruction of his lineage, with the annihilation of all the members of the lineage. It is not necessary to say that the Gelms obtained very soon almost all the stones that still continued in the hands of the native populations. Contrary to the priests of the cult, they only remitted some of them to the wide fraternity. Others were reserved to be used in magical acts, because they boasted to know their secrets and use it in profit of their plans. And to them denominated, pejoratively, serpent eggs. The lords of Tharsis, it is clear, never trusted in the Gelms, neither were intimidated by their threats. But the wise sword was a reality that had converted in popular legend, and which could not be seriously denied. The Gelms suspected from the beginning that in such arm existed a secret vestige of the pact of blood. Because the lords of Tharsis not acceded to give it voluntarily, and that it could not be bought at any price, decided to apply against them all the resources of the magic, the diabolic powers of the power of the matter. And here the surprise of the Gelms was huge, because they realized that such powers couldn't do anything against the demental fire that turned on the blood of the lords of Tharsis. The madness, warrior or mystical, which distinguished them as unpredictable and indomitable men, situated them also out of the reach of the magic spells of the Gelms. They had no other choice, according to their demonic designs, than to appropriate by force the wise sword and condemn the house of Tharsis to the extermination sentence. This was, Dr. Sentinel, the real reason of the continuous state of war that the lords of Tharsis had to live onwards, what meant the definitive loss of the illusory sovereignty enjoyed until then, and not the greed that foreign populaces and conquerors would have fed by their riches. On the contrary, not existed in the whole world a king, lord, or simple adventurer of war, that the Gelms not tried to allure with the conquest of Tharsis, with the fabled booty in silver and gold that would win who tries the feat. And with their intrigues which caused the constant siege of pirates and bandits. While they could, the lords of Tharsis resisted the pressure by their own means, that's to say, with the concourse of the warriors of my population. But when this was not possible anymore, especially when they knew that the Phoenicians of Tyre were concentrating a powerful mercenary army in the Balearics to invade and colonize Tharsis, they had no other choice than to accept help, naturally interested, of a foreign populace. They requested help to Lydia, a Pelasgian nation, from the Aegean Sea, integrated by eminent navigators whose overseas ships landed in Onaba 2 or 3 times every year to merchandise with the people of Tharsis. They had the defect that they were also merchants, and producers of dispensable goods, and they were accustomed to practices and habits more culturally advanced than the primitive Iberians. But, in compensation, they exhibited the important attribute that they were of our same race and demonstrated an undoubtedly ability for war. For Pelasgian's history has known a group of populations established in different Mediterranean and Tyrrhenian coasts of the Aegean Peninsula and from Asia Minor. Thereby, to find a common origin amongst all of them, it is necessary to go back to the beginning of history, to the subsequent times of the Atlantean catastrophe, when the White Atlantans instituted the Pact of Blood with the natives of the Iberian Peninsula. Really, in the time was only one native populace, which was separated according to the Atlantans' exogamy laws in three big groups: the Iberians, the Basques, and the one that would be later, the Pelasgians. Each one of those big groups was subdivided, internally, in three, in every tribal social organization of the villages, populations and kingdoms. The unique population would be known after the departure of the White Atlantans, as Vertians, or Vrtyons, that is to say, breeders. But the name soon would be changed in Vitrions, Vetrions, and, due to the influence of other populaces, especially the Phoenicians, in Varians, or Rheans. The giant Rhean, with a pair of legs, that is to say, with just one racial base, but triple form above the waist, that's to say, with 3 bodies and 3 heads, it came from an ancient Pelasgian myth, in which the original population was represented with the triple exogamy division, imposed by the White Atlantans. Through the pass of the centuries, the 3 big groups of the native population were identified by their particular names and the original unity was forgotten. The rivalries and intrigues stimulated since the cultural pact contributed to it, finishing each group convinced of their racial and cultural individuality. To the Iberians, I already mentioned, because from them I descend, and I will continue quoting them in this history. From the Basques, I will not tell anything except that they promptly betrayed the pact of blood and allied to the cultural pact, error that they would pay with great suffering, and a high strategic confusion, because they were a population of very pure blood. Concerning to the Pelasgians, the case is quite simple. After the departure of the White Atlantans, they were massively accompanied by the Pelasgians, to whom they had entrusted the work to transport them by sea to Anatolia. There, they bade farewell to the White Atlantans, and decided to stay in the zone, giving place with the time to a numerous formation of a confederation of populations. Successive invasions obeyed them in many opportunities to abandon their settlements, but, as they became excellent navigators, they knew how to go out fine from all their misfortunes. However, those emplacements would bring them again in direction to the Iberian Peninsula. In the moment when occurred the alliance with the Lydian, century 8, before Christ, other groups of Pelasgians already occupied Italy and the Gaul under the name of Tresgans, Tyrrhenian, Tresgans, Terascos, Ruscos, Rasenius, etc. The group of the Lydian, that the lords of Tharsis convoked, still remained in Asia Minor, although resisting, on that age of terrible food shortage. They recognized by the traditions the propinquity which connected them to the Iberians, but they affirmed to descend from Main's legendary ancestor, who is no other than Menu, the flawless archetype of the animal man, imposed in their cults by the priests of the cultural pact. Once achieved the agreement with the ambassadors of the king of Lydia, which included the well-known Princess Interchange, tens of Pelasgian ships started to arrive in the ports of Tharsis. They came replete of fearsome warriors, but also brought many families of settlers disposed to establish definitively amongst those distant relatives, who great fame had for their riches and prosperity. That Pacific invasion didn't enthuse my people too much, but they couldn't do anything about it because everyone comprehended the imminence of the Phoenician danger. That peril didn't disappear until they warned the change of situation and evaluated the cost that would suppose now the conquest of Tharsis. In this time the Gellams were eluded, but they would not forget the wise sword, neither the lords of Tharsis, nor the sentence of extermination that was over them. In such circumstances, the alliance with the Pelasgians was a success in every perspective. The Lydian people were counted amongst the first populations of the Pact of Blood that had defeated the taboo of iron and knew the secret of the smelting and wrought. In the time, the swords of iron were the most powerful weapons on the earth. However, even though they were remarkable merchants, they never sold an iron weapon, which were only produced in right quantity for their own use. They fabricated, instead, a high number of bronze weapons for the sale or barter. Therefore their interest to stay in Tharsis, where the copper veins of high quality were well known, since legendary times, when the Atlantans were crossing the Western Sea, and extracted the copper with the aid of the ray of Poseidon. The copper was not almost exploited by the lords of Tharsis, dazzled by the gold and silver that bought everything. The association with the Lydian essentially modified that criterion and introduced in the population a newfangled lifestyle, based in the production of cultural objects massive destined exclusively for the commerce. A deterrent wall of stone rose around the ancient citadel of Tharsis, that the Pelasgians called Tartessos, which ended giving name to the country, with a perimeter that comprised now an area 4 or 5 times larger. The old citadel was transformed in a huge market, and in the new fortified spaces the ateliers and factories emerged every day. The woven, dresses, footwear, utensils, potteries, furniture, gold objects, silver, copper and bronze, practically not existed commodity that could not be bought in Tartessos. And except for the tin, indispensable for the bronze industry, which was taken from Albion, all, even the food, was produced in Tartessos. Evidently, by influence of the cultural pact, the alliance between my population and the Lydian culminated in a civilizing explosion. Thereupon the seigneury of Tharsis was converted in the kingdom of Tartessos, and, in a few centuries, it expanded through all Andalusia. The Tartessians founded then important cities, as Menas, today called Torque del March, or Meseta, which the usurper Carthaginiensis renamed as Carthagena. The fleet reached to be such powerful as the Phoenician, and its commerce, highly competitive for the best quality of the products, achieved to put in great danger the economy of the Red Men. Recently, since the 4 before Christ century, due to the Greek colonization and the expansion of the Phoenician colony of Carthage, declined a little the commercial and maritime Mediterranean supremacy of the Tartessians. I must insist that the fact of being close relatives facilitated enormously in the integration with the Pelasgians. That could be specially proved in the case of the cult, where there was almost no difference between the two populaces, because the Lydian worshipped also the goddess of fire, who they knew as Belith. In few words, for the Lydian, Belina was Bel, and BELICENA was Belith. Also, because they came from a region where the cultural pact had major influence, presented some differences in the language and in the sacred alphabet. The ancient Pelasgian language, that in my was still spoken with great purity, had suffered in the Lydian, the influence of the Semitic and Asiatic languages. However, that sailor jargon was more adequate for the overseas commerce that they practiced. The other difference was in the alphabet. Since thousands years that my people had forgotten the language of the birds. However, the last initiates, and the priests of the flame, conserved the sacred alphabet of 13 plus 3 runes, which they represented with 16 signs formed by straight lines and had associated with the common language. In this way was disposed from 13 consonants and 3 vowels. The vowels were only known by the lords of Tharsis, because they expressed the Pelasgian name, secret, of the goddess Moon, something like O. Well, the newness that brought the Lydian was a sacred alphabet composed by 13 plus 5 letters, that is to say, by 18 signs which represented quite sounds of the common language. They had also 13 consonants, but the vowels were 5, and, the 2 added, the Lydian could not suppress them any more without losing more than a half of their words. The most important of all this, something that would have to be agreed immediately, was the name of the goddess and the number of the sacred alphabet. In regard to the first, it was agreed to refer to the goddess in the successive by an older name, which was common to the two populaces, Pyrene. Since then, BELICENA, and Belith, would be for the Tartessians, the goddess of fire Pyrene. Referring to the second, the lords of Tharsis, who were affected in that moment by the enemy pressure, they had no other choice than to accept the imposition of the sacred alphabet of 18 letters. The only solace, they said with irony, consisted in that the number 18 was most pleasant for the goddess than the 16. Otherwise, the Lydian had suffered a similar luck to my people. In some moment of their history they were defeated by the war fatigue and finally yielded to the populaces of the cultural pact. The last of their initiates achieved then to impress the familiar missions, even in the highest number, of lineages than those that existed amongst my people, that explained the enormous amount of families of artisans, specialized in the most varied occupations, that integrated the population of the Lydian